some regions, but large uncertainties and knowledge gaps exist in relation to technological maturity, physical understanding, potential impacts and challenges of governance that may constrain the ability to implement SRM in the near future. One of the pieces of literature that has been assessed by the IPCC indicates that the use of SRM would create its own risks and would only make any sense in a world experiencing or expecting severe climate change impacts. And as such, consideration of SRM takes place in a risk-risk context, whereby the risks of application are judged against the risks from climate change without SRM. So considering the impacts of SRM in isolation can be misleading, as SRM's sole raison d'etre, reason to be, is the reduction or avoidance of climate impacts stemming from elevated greenhouse gas concentrations. And to be relevant, assessment of SRM needs to enhance our understanding of potential effects across a multitude of socially relevant parameters rather than a single one. Chapter 16 in the report of the IPCC Working Group 2 concludes that in part to limited SRM research, there is low confidence in projected benefits or risks to crop yields, economies, human health, or ecosystems. Large negative impacts are projected from rapid warming, from a sudden and sustained termination of SRM in a high CO2 emission scenario, and indicates that co-evolution of SRM governance and research provides a chance for responsibly developing SRM technologies with broader public participation and political legitimacy, guarding against potential risks and harms relevant across a range of scenarios. Several possible institutional arrangements have been considered for SRM governance under the United Nations Framework Convention or the United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity. Reasons for states to join an international governance framework for SRM include the prevention of unilateral action by others and benefiting from research. Alongside the UNFCCC through the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SUBSTA, also the WMO, UNESCO, and UN Environment could play a role in governance of SRM. Each of these organizations has relevance with respect to the regulatory framework. And finally, an equitable institutional or governance arrangement around SRM would have to reflect the views of different countries and be multilateral because of the risk of termination and risks that implementation or unilateral action by one country or organization producing negative precipitation or extreme events has effects across borders. So with this, Elia, I summed up, I guess, on the points that Kai have already brought in, and I'm absolutely sure that the next presentations will provide some specific regional examples of the potential risks of SRM. So thank you very much for the opportunity again.
Thank you, Thelma. We are now moving to a pre-recorded presentation by Matthias Honegger. He was unable to be with us for the full length of the event, but he will be joining us for the Q&A portion. So please formulate your questions if you have any. His presentation is focused on the implications of SRM for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And a quick introduction to Matthias. He's a senior climate research associate with Perspective Climate Research. His expertise is in climate policy, UNFCCC negotiations, and governance of geoengineering. He researches the diverging views on solar radiation modification and carbon dioxide removal among climate policy negotiators and observers, and the tensions between popular expectations, economic models, and policy planning. He has authored numerous articles, commentaries, and reports on policy design for carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification, and led the first assessment of their potential effects on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal. So give me just 1 second to launch his presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and it is a pleasure to be speaking to you today a little bit about why thinking about the SDGs and SRM in the context of overshooting climate temperature targets might be important, and to share some insights from a previous study where we explored interactions between SDGs and SRM, potential SRM deployment, and yeah, give you some insight into that study. It's clear, when we think about SRM, we think about the future and we have different assumptions how this could play out, but there are at least 3 pathways through which SRM could be impacting on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as a major orientation point or a guidance for how we collectively envisage, a beneficial future for everyone on this planet. And so those impact pathways, they go through, on the one hand, through the physics, where climate overshoot really accentuates the worries that we have about climate impacts, which really affect all of the 17 SDGs quite majorly, as far as we can tell, and the evidence out there is quite clear on that, as you've probably heard also from the IPCC, and our expectation of overshooting based also on reports by UNEP, for example. It is clear that we have there a very big concern of physical impacts through climate change on the Sustainable Development Goals as such. And on the other hand, there's 2 additional pathways through which imagined SRM would be expected to impact on SDGs, and that's through, their modulation of climate impacts on the one hand, so both potentially drastically reducing climate impacts and potentially altering them in other ways as well, and then the physical and political and economic side effects or social side effects from doing SRM onto the broader landscape of SDG and global governance efforts. So those 3 impact pathways are really, if we boil it down in a very simplistic way, the climate risk attenuation effect potentially from SRM affecting all SDGs in a major way, then the physical side effects as mentioned, and the non-physical implications. And all of those are cutting across in potentially hard to anticipate ways, and so it's important to explore them with a broad lens and in an integrative manner across disciplines as well. So diving a bit deeper, what we found in our study a couple of years ago is within the first causal chain, climate effects are altered, and thus basically the major effect is that SDG 13 is really affected through potential SRM use. And so if we are able through some form of SRM to, for example, avoid temperature overshoot as a sort of major indicator, this would certainly affect SDG 13, and by extension, through the arrows directly and indirectly, pretty much almost all other SDGs in one way or another. And this is simply by attenuating climate change, and the evidence on the interlinkage between climate and other SDGs is quite clear. On the side effects of physical nature, there are some indications that, directly the natural environment in the seas and on land could be affected through physical side effects, positively and negatively to some extent. And so generally speaking, there's a strong biophysical influence also on goals such as zero hunger, health, water, energy, and again, the ecosystems. And then there's indirect influence, which propagates in known and sometimes unknown manners between those and the less directly physically affected SDGs. So there are indirect effects that could potentially take place. But all of that, again, against the backdrop of considering the very serious risks of climate change across all, especially in case of overshoot. The third causal chain is of a very different nature, of course, and that's has to do with the political side of this. Doing SRM would not be merely a act affecting the physical world, but also the political, the economic, and the social world. And so these effects are harder to anticipate, but it's clear that perhaps the strongest effects might be on willingness and ability to alleviate poverty. So there could be very strong positive effects, as well as potentially challenges. If there's a distraction from the efforts in poverty alleviation, this is very speculative, but there are some concerns around that. And other effects could also similarly affect political priorities across the board. And also certainly the global nature of SRM could intersect in complex ways with partnership for the goals, and institutions and a sort of global cooperation efforts and abilities, both positively and negatively in difficult to anticipate ways. So overall, you can see that there's a very strong expectation of direct and indirect effects across all these 17 SDGs in the three causal impact pathways that I outlined, both the direct physical ones with intended and unintended effects, as well as the indirect or non-physical ones, which nonetheless affect in important ways likely the pursuit of the SDG. So both with a very substantial risk attenuation potential, especially considering the risk of overshooting temperature targets, but of course also with significant risk potential, additional risk potential, but of a different nature, as outlined. So how do we actually approach this? We drew obviously on the literature out there, but this literature is often spread out through different disciplines, different fields, and often not presented in a cohesive manner. And on the other hand, we have this the wheel of the 17 SDGs, which represents really the diversity of social objectives on a global scale, and we try to bring both together through a transdisciplinary review. And you can see the article that came from that. There's also a brief version on C2G's website, because C2G gracefully supported our work in this. So you can get the short version of this on C2G's website. And we did this by drawing on the expertise of diverse global experts in relevance to the SDGs in the 17 different dimensions thereof, as well as experts in SRM, both the physical and the social and political side of SRM. So to give you a bit more concrete examples, and you can again find the full list of potential implications in the supplementary materials. Basically, for example, for SDG 1, for the goal of ending poverty in all its forms everywhere, we found, especially in regards to the first causal chain, that ending poverty in all its forms everywhere is really under pressure if we are overshooting temperature targets. I think someone said a few years ago that overshooting 1.5 or even limiting warming to 1.5 would almost threaten the well-being of the African continent as such. This might be a stark statement, but this is there are very serious concerns about especially exceeding 1.5 and even worse when we have to look at potentially exceeding 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So if SRM were to work as intended, any attenuation of climate impacts would very seriously enhance the outlook for SDG 1 in this very direct manner. Now, of course, there would potentially be, through the second causal chain, through side effects of physical nature, there could also be adverse outcomes if SRM were to be designed in a manner that does not actually advance the situation of the world's poorest. And there are concerns about participation if the world's poorest, as they tend to be disadvantaged in deliberation processes, they could be further disadvantaged through potential secondary or otherwise negative effects. And that the same concern, of course, counts not just for physical effects, but also for social and political effects if, for example, SRM deployment were to distract from SDG 1 and the efforts to pursue this. SDG 17 is a particular one insofar that it really is an enabler for all the other SDGs. And so I think especially here the discussion is around the socioeconomic and political and cultural effects that could flow from SRM use. And this is a very difficult to explore, I think a very hard to anticipate potential for effects. Whereas, on the one hand, the necessary coordination, and I'm starting here with the second point, necessary coordination of doing SRM in a globally concerted manner could enhance global cooperation and result in strengthened processes, including with regard to ensuring the participation of, stakeholders, which we all are across the world. So this could also be an opportunity. And at the same time, there are very relevant concerns that, if SRM is pursued in a less coordinated manner, and thus, the topic of today's panel is around governance as well. Without good governance, including on a global level, that builds the trust and collaboration abilities on a global scale, SRM could potentially pose a challenge to partnership for the goals and generally the means of implementation for reaching the SDGs and similar goals that might flow from them in the future beyond 2030. These reflections draw primarily on the first publication here. Like I said, you can find the full list of potential implications as an annex to this publication online. If these hyperlinks are made available, you can just click right on them and reach the publications. There's also in the IRGC report, to which I contributed, a chapter on risk trade-offs. There's also discussion on certain aspects relevant here, especially with regard to the risk of seeing unilateral or otherwise dangerous use of SRM, which is accentuated, of course, once climate impact pressures are rising, which they are expected to do, especially if we overshoot 1.5 degrees. And so there's a bit of a dual nature here if we think about SRM posing a potential threat, but at the same time perhaps offering a very significant opportunity for limiting risks of overshoot, as SRM can potentially be used to slow or perhaps even temporarily halt the increase of global average temperatures. And so the third publication here by my colleague Axel Michailova talks about the rising threat of unilateral SRM use, and again, a threat which is accentuated should we see warming exceed levels where individual countries or regions start to consider SRM as their only option at a certain stage. This is certainly a concern, and certainly for me personally, a very big reason why we cannot ignore the governance of SRM and need to engage proactively on this topic. So with that, I close my presentation. I look forward to actually be joining you in person during the Q&A. Thank you.
So that was for Matthias Honegger's presentation. We'll now give the floor to Asima Kamal Mauni, who is our youth representative from Bangladesh. And she's an engaged youth actor advocating for environmental governance. She holds a bachelor degree in environmental science and management and has actively participated in high-level panel discussions on climate action. She has worked as a research assistant and was an intern until very recently at the International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research in Bangladesh, where she continued to develop her expertise in the field. And she's particularly interested in this issue of governance of solar radiation modification. So I will now give the floor to you, Asima. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Alia, for the introduction, and it is my pleasure to be able to speak in today's event. I'll be talking about the need for youth involvement in the governance discussions of solar radiation modifications. So we are facing a climate crisis, and that is in and of itself intergenerational. The decisions we make today will directly impact the future of the next generations. So while we're talking about these emerging technologies, such as solar radiation modification, it is crucial that young people's voices are heard and they actively participate in the decision-making process. Because they're the closest link to the generations yet to come and will be responsible in ensuring a decent livelihoods for them. Therefore, we need to provide young people with proper training and access to information to be able to include them in a relevant, legitimate, and in a non-tokenistic way in the governance discussions of around solar radiation modification. We also need to popularize this science among youth so that we can build their awareness and understanding about solar radiation modification and the dire need for its effective governance. The sooner young people understand SRM, the better prepared they will be to take positions at the decision-making tables, and which is actually going to determine their future. So we can consider them as full-blown actors in the governance of solar radiation modification. And through this, we will be able to foster a sense of ownership and responsibility for this technology, which would lead to a more informed and engaged public. So I am going to talk about some policy recommendations that I, along with my colleagues, have published on this STI forum. The science policy brief, which was entitled as Solar Radiation Modification and Youth Perspectives on its Governance. So we mentioned 4 policy recommendations, which was informing, consulting, collaborating, including. all of which involve youth engagement. Through informing, we made the point that it is crucial to provide young people with accurate and up-to-date information about solar radiation modification, about its benefits, its risks, the risk analysis through mainstreaming climate change science in the curriculums at an early stage. Social sciences should also be connected to solar radiation modification discussions because it is through the social science we will be able to address the ethical and political questions, which is very important for its governance. And through consulting young people's ideas and opinions on solar radiation modification governance can be collected through surveys and public meetings. Collaborating, we can empower young people to build their capacity, establish networks, partnerships, create youth-led programs at local, national, and international levels to facilitate dialogue and collaboration between youth organizations, academia, government, and industry, and all the different stakeholders that is related with solar radiation modification, including we could also provide concrete spaces for young people to participate directly in policymaking, training, and resources for advocacy, research, innovation activities, and policymaking. It is very essential to recruit young and early career individuals as policy advisors, scientists, and public and diplomatic services to ensure that their active participation in the development and decision-making process of this governance discussions of solar radiation modification is being considered. Actions of specific importance could include providing training and resources for young people to become involved in advocacy and in research and innovation activities, but also creating opportunities for the youth to actively participate in policymaking. As governance frameworks for solar radiation modification are still to be designed, which is very important, fostering meaningful youth engagement from the beginning is an opportunity that should not be missed if we are to ensure that those processes will be inclusive and future-proof. So as an environmental science and management student, I realized two important things during my earlier years of studies. Firstly, wherever I looked, I saw a problem, and I felt like I'm responsible for those. So I felt overwhelmed by the multitude of environmental issues. I understood its complexity at the very beginning, and like littering, plastic pollution, water scarcity, air pollution, food wastage, and so on. Everything left me so hopeless. And also, secondly, what I realized is that everyone has a say about environmental science or climate change, as every human on Earth is a stakeholder of this environment, of our climate. And I also realized that when 7 billion people, or like when a lot of amount of people will have a say about one thing, it would never be possible to bring 100% agreement around one issue, specifically when one's comfort and lifestyle are so closely related to the emergence of a problem. So while studying solar radiation modification and the need for strengthening its governance, it has become apparent that, like climate change, SRM will always have proponents and opponents. Therefore, in order to establish a consensus on whether or not SRM can be utilized as a supplementary measure to address overshoot, we need a transparent, inclusive, and effective governance, which is very important. And with saying that, there is no single solution or no silver bullet solution through which we would be able to address the complex issue of climate change, and we must look at multiple solutions to combat this problem. I also found one of this interesting thing that it is worth noting, which is in the past, we humans interfered with the climate system through industrialization and other activities, often without fully comprehending the natural processes involved. So discussions about human-induced climate change started years after industrialization revolution, which is common. And also, interestingly, even before the realization that climate change is a natural phenomenon. So we started talking about human-induced climate change even before realizing that climate change is a natural phenomenon, and that has occurred throughout the Earth's history, like surviving us through the past, the Ice Age. This happened as we were less informed. We were not informed about what the The people were not informed about what the consequences of deploying new technologies could be. We did not have any governance mechanism for technologies that we invented and deployed, and we are still quite running that way. However, we cannot afford to repeat these same mistakes, and it is crucial to establish robust governance mechanism for technologies like solar radiation modifications, what is emerging technology and what we are talking about now. It is very important to establish robust governance mechanism, and through which we would be able to avoid potential negative impacts on the environment and society. We need to conduct a thorough risk analysis of SRM, develop transparent, accountable, inclusive governance frameworks, and ensure that all stakeholders are included in the decision-making process. I would like to conclude by saying that we should work together to ensure that discussions on the governance of SRM are conducted in a transparent, accountable, and inclusive way, so that through which we can pave the way for a sustainable and equitable future for the generations to come. Thank you. Over to you, Alia.
Thank you so much, Asima. Thanks for sharing your perspectives. Very insightful. Before we give the floor to Dr. Chris Leonard, I would just like to remind everybody that you can formulate your questions in the Q&A box as they come to you, and we'll be addressing them in just a moment. So a quick introduction of Dr. Chris Leonard. He's a climate scientist and at the Climate System Analysis Group of the University of Cape Town, whose research interests include regional climate information, regional climate modeling, renewable energy, understanding extreme climate events, and building African climate scientists' capacity in climate research. He is involved in several projects, including the Wind Atlas for South Africa, Health Radar, the Degrees Modeling Fund, and Focus Africa. He has authored or co-authored over 60 academic publications and 5 book chapters, including as lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Land and Climate, and serves on various committees within the World Climate Research Program. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks so much. And Asima, thank you for your talk. I'll hopefully reflect a little bit of what you said in my presentation also. So let me start by sharing the screen and firing up the presentation. Just so that no one's confused, I'm not a young scientist by any stretch of the imagination. If you can see my beard, there's a lot of gray coming out there. I've been asked to talk to you largely about how do we build capacity to do SRM type research in the global south. And that's what I'm going to try and do in the next, hopefully less than 10 minutes. So let's dive straight in, assuming, there we go. The reason for developing capacity to do research in the global south is largely because the global south is the most vulnerable, has the most vulnerable communities to climate variability and climate change. And by inference, then also to any kind of SRM or efforts that may take place. There's this band of very high vulnerable communities in the tropics and in the subtropics, and then Africa stands out really obviously as probably the most vulnerable place in the world when it comes to climate variability and climate change. That vulnerability contributes to risk. So risk is defined by the IPCC in this image is a function of vulnerability, the climate hazard, and the type of exposure that any community has towards the hazard. And this creates risk, and risk is emergent, and risks can be key risks. And this all creates an impact. So depending on how at risk you are of a particular event, that will have impacts, and so it will affect your lifestyle. We tried to add, this is called the risk propeller. We tried to add in this latest IPCC process another blade to the propeller that took into account any response. So if you are at risk, you want to try and adapt to that risk or do something about it to alleviate the risk perhaps. And that response may lessen your risk, but if you're doing something wrong that you're not aware of, it may also increase your risk. And this is also where SRM fits in. So we want to understand what are the risks that we might be facing if we eventually, God forbid, have to seriously think about SRM. So we want to understand risk in this more holistic kind of context where we're looking at exposure to climate hazard, assessing what our vulnerabilities are, what the impact might be, but then also how does our risk change if we respond to that risk? And in our context, it's an SRM type of context. Africa is where I live. It's what I know. I am reluctant to speak to other places, but future risks in Africa are higher, as was alluded to in an earlier talk. We're at 1.5 degrees global warming. So again, 1.5 degrees is this nebulous political term. What does it mean at the regional scale? So if the globe is at 1.5, what happens at the regional scale? And for me, at an African scale. In our IPCC report, we assessed that, this is chapter 9 of working group 2, we assessed that there are large regional crop losses. Poverty and equality increases quite dramatically. This is also mentioned earlier. There's increased exposure to various diseases as the disease vectors expand their, their habitats, increasing drought and increasing heat mortality. And there's a very big red blob in West Africa about that. What happens if we go above 1.5 degrees, which, as Thelma showed us, is extremely likely going to happen? The risk becomes very, very high to us, in that now, instead of just having regional crop loss or yield losses, that becomes extremely widespread over many, many regions. 7 to 18% of African species are at risk of extinction. And you all know Africa is a place for animals. You come and spend money here, which is when we enjoy that. Really importantly, an over 30% decline in fisheries is what we assessed. And for many lake and sea communities, fisheries is their lifestyle, it's their livelihood. And if this decline occurs, they lose their livelihood. And again, that's a really, really high risk. Widespread heat-related mortality risk. And then this all comes together for severe risks of malnutrition because it impacts the entire food system. So this is what we're facing. This is the risk that we have a look at. The UNEP report that was mentioned earlier has a short quote from it, is that SRM is the only option to cool the planet within years. And this is not what they say, this is what I'm suggesting, is that this might reduce some of the risks that that you can see above there, if we are able to cool the planet by some half a degree or degrees or some measure. However, SRM does carry with it its own risk. And this is, again, where Thelma was talking about the risk framing, that we always need to think this through. What is the risk from greenhouse gas emissions and global warming? What is the risk then posed by SRM? And we need to continually keep this mindset, this risk framing mindset. So we have to do research to understand how these risks may change. So if we're going to warm to 2.5 degrees or 2.7 degrees, we decide SRM is the way to go. And what does that mean for us, for me in Southern Africa, really? In order to increase and enhance our understanding, we need to do research. And we do that research, hopefully in this decade. This decade, in the latest synthesis report, has been called the decade of action. So basically, we have this decade left to try and do something about climate change and the impacts of climate change. But we have to do research to understand what that might look like. So in Africa, what does the funding research landscape look like? Here's a graph that we've put in our chapter. The blue curve is global funding for climate research since 1990. And it's nice. That yellow one that barely leaves the zero line, that's the money that was directed towards Africa for climate research over Africa. And if you do the sums, you get to only 3.8% of global climate research funding was spent on Africa since 1990. And given the most vulnerable context that we sit in, that's not great. It gets a little bit worse because if you try and figure out where that money went to, it basically goes back to the funders. So if you're American doing research on Africa, the money stays with you. It doesn't actually go to African researchers. It goes back to whoever funded it. And most of the funding originated in the US and the UK and the EU, and it went back there. So less than 1% of funding for climate research over Africa since 1990 actually went to African scientists. And this is not the funding that you're looking for. If you know what the date is today, that will mean something to you. But there's a really This is a really big problem, because if the question is, how do we create researchers within the global south to think about SRM research and what it might mean, it does require funding that can actually let us do that, because at the moment we can't. So this funding model is not what you're looking for. What we are part of, or what I'm part of, is the opposite of what I've just shown you. And this is the Degrees Initiative. It's called the DMF Fund. And largely what this group is doing is that they're trying to let us as developing nation scientists do our own research into SRM. So putting developing countries at the center of SRM conversation. Pre-2018, this is where SRM research is being done. And you can see it's largely in the global north, perhaps except for India and China. When the Degrees Initiative came along, they got a bit of money and they were able to bring in some more countries from the global south to do SRM research. And in 2023, they got a bit more money and were able to empower some more scientists in some more countries to do SRM research. So you can see within the space of about 5 years, just because there's funding, and it's not big funding, it's a small bit of funding, but it's actually empowering us as Southern researchers to move into this space and to actually create a voice. Asima was talking about the youth voice. This is kind of like that, in that it's the Southern voice that's becoming more and more louder, I hope, in the community. What have we done? We've moved largely in the physical science space, and these are the papers that we've written, and they are from all over the world, South America, Africa, Asia. And these are often the first papers that have been published on SRM research in the particular regions. So it's been a really big deal. In this, I think there are 12 or 13 papers here. There will be 5 more coming out this year, and even more than that in the next 3 years, because those 2023 projects have only just come online and they will last 3 years. So it's really getting into the academics of it. And a small bit of, coming back to this graph, a small bit of funding has gone a long way to increase our understanding of what SRM might do to the climate of Africa and in southern nations. But where can we go to from here? And this is where our current thinking is. Could we develop something like a Southern Research Center of Excellence for SRM research, or a research hub where we can coordinate different types of research into SRM? And here, going back to that understanding of risk, where we have hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and response, we want to try and understand, this again is all just in my head at the moment, and a few of us are thinking about this, but understanding regional climate risk in the risk framing. What might this consider? There would likely be some kind of climate science. There would have to be some climate science being done in this. When you're looking at atmospheric processes, what does SRM do to the El Nino? That type of thing. Develop scenarios. You'd have to do climate model development to understand theoretically what might happen, and then also downscaling to get information at a regional scale. There would also have to be something like impact science, I imagine, where you're looking at what are the impacts of this change on hydrology, agriculture, health, or energy. There would need to be a social science component to this, where we think about ethics and climate government, risk, behavioral change, economics. And what's come out here is perhaps other aspects like political science, where we start thinking about, so how do we make all of this work if we do eventually get there? So I hope that's been useful, and I will hand back to you. I'll stop sharing. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Chris. We've had some very interesting presentations, and I'm sure the discussion that will follow in the Q&A portion will be just as interesting. I'll now give the floor back to Kai, who will be facilitating the Q&A. And I see that we've already gotten a couple of questions in the Q&A box and some answers in writing. Kai, I don't know if you want to pick up these questions and address them live, or if we should see if anybody else has any questions. I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you very much. Maybe first, if everyone now can turn on the video, so we become like a group together. And maybe turn off your microphone. I have to switch it off because I might have background noises soon. Anyway, so thank you very much. Thank you very much for the questions which have already appeared in the Q&A interface. Please continue adding there. they have been answered in writing, so I maybe come back to those which have been answered later on to make sure that everyone is becoming aware of that. One was having, well, there is one open one. Let me just have a clicker, of course. We have one question is that there are many stakeholders which are skeptical that the UN can move swiftly enough to develop an effective governance mechanism. Would a multi-stakeholder partnership be more effective, as private sector governments, civic groups, and multilateral organizations could all have voting rights in setting global norms? If there's anyone who would like to react to that kind of question, feels comfortable in doing so. While you're thinking.
Okay, Kai.
Thelma, yes, please.
No, yeah, okay, thanks. No, let us kick off. Melt the ice, as we say. Yeah, so, but the response I'm gonna give is not to be confounded with any prescriptiveness from the IPCC. So I'm giving my response on the basis of my own assessment. So I concur, that some of the suggestions that have been provided, including in the IPCC, as I have given in one of my slides, might lead to long discussions where we might need to take, more quick action. In this respect, I think that the idea of partnerships is interesting, but obviously we would have to find, identify these partnerships, who would finance these partnerships, because without funding to promote or to seed the scientific project, it's going to be a little bit complicated. I find that, there are some initiatives that are already financing, in particular, some NGOs that are financing some research on SRM, but mostly in isolation and not necessarily as a big partnership where you have different groups of people with different expertises that could really contribute all together for advancing. Partnerships, I think, that could also be more regionally, put together. And that would be a benefit, I would say, instead of having, a framing that would put every single country in the same basket. So yeah, that's some of the inputs to me. I appreciate in the partnerships the interdisciplinarity, the transdisciplinary approaches that could be provided, and I think that all things could be explored. Yeah. So thanks for the question, and I hope I have helped to respond.
Thank you very much. Maybe before I have a few questions in case we don't get more, so to say, coming up. But maybe if any one of you would like to react to the questions which were in the Q&A exchange, maybe that's now that we have the ice broken and we're beginning to swim in the water. Matthias, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, perhaps I'd also address Paul Zeitz's question on the UN as the sort of central decision-making point, and whether there might be other contexts in which decisions might be taken more pragmatically or inclusively in some ways. I think it's a matter of, dissecting a little bit what types of decisions we are looking at. Now, imminently, the main decisions are around, empowering research to take place, and if research is to take place, in what forms, and what boundary conditions, how to shape it in such a way that we avoid, falling into a trap of either nature, either a slippery slope towards SRM use, or locking it out entirely from the beginning. So questions around that, I think, are best, in some sense, addressed at a national level. Research funding agencies have a main say in that, but at the same time, they need to learn from their peers in other countries, I think. So, setting up of certain ethics boards, etc., to explore what could be undesired effects of certain types of research depending on how they're set up. So those are all issues that can be tackled today. In fact, I think in some countries are starting to go towards those immediate steps to figure out what may make sense and what may be risky. And it's a very different type of question compared to what we often have in mind, which is this long-term question, should we do SRM? And who's the we in this question is always challenging to answer as well. Is it the international community, quote unquote, and what does that mean again? So clearly there are some questions that will need to be answered at a global level, and whether some UN forum will be the best place to do that or not is one can debate. It's a matter of really looking closely, I think, what do we need answered right now, or what steering do we need to have in place right now?
Thank you very much, Matthias. Any reactions on that from the panel? No, not really. Okay, then you know what? Maybe Asima, I can inject a question to you. Is that how could young people and youth-led organizations be better included in discussions around SRM? What do you see like key factors in that to place? You heard that there are these proposals of these various modalities of partnerships, research activities, etc. Maybe you have some ideas to share there.
Yeah, thank you, Kai, for the question. So to engaging youth and youth-led organizations to be better included, as I've also mentioned while I was talking, we can empower youth voices by providing the youth-led organizations to engage in meaningful and informed discussions. We need to educate and build awareness among young people. We can do this through educational programs, workshops, seminars, which is focused on SRM and the need, and specifically giving importance to the need for the strengthening of its governance, and collaboration between youth-led organizations and SRM governance stakeholders can also lead to more informed and engaged public in inclusive decision-making. So all in all, there is a need for transparency and accountability while all of this is happening in the governance of SRM. And and the young people and youth-led organizations need to have the proper access to information and be involved in the whole process.
Thank you very much, Asima. Now, I just keep choosing the one or the other of our panelists and address a question pending open questions which you might have. Chris, how you think capacity building efforts can be scaled up to ensure that a wide range of stakeholders in the Global South are equipped to participate in decision making? You pointed and alluded to this in your presentation, but maybe you have some additional thoughts on that.
Yeah, we're trying to, in the Global South, come up to speed at a higher rate, I suppose, than we're trying to approach Global North levels of understanding and competency. So in order to do that, we have to start at the beginning. And I think I'm prejudiced because I'm a physical scientist. I always go to natural and physical science first. And I think creating a competent scientific community to actually explore the modeling work that gets done and what the potential futures might look like is a starting point, because you've got to build on something. You've got to build on a foundation that is relatively realistic. We're living in a theoretical world at the moment. We're living in a model world. So interrogate the models and understand properly what the models are telling us. But we've got a decade, I think. It is the decade of action, according to the IPCC. And if we can build that scientific layer, I suppose, within the next 5 or 7 years, then we've done something right. But at the same time, needing to engage in all the different spheres that have been mentioned here, the governance, the ethics, youth. And these are not my communities. So I don't know where to start. And this is, again, creating the Southern network over the next 2 to 4 years of who needs to be a part of the discussion. I think is what we need to actively start to do. And not only people who are like researchers like myself, but also folk who are critical of SRM. There's a comment there about the risk framing versus the precautionary principle framing. So engage all of these different thoughts in the same space to see if we can actually make headway. But it's going to take a lot of work. And as Thelma also mentioned, it's going to take a lot of funding. Where is the funding going to come from to fund Southern researchers to do this kind of work? It's not going to come from the US. It's not going to come from the EU. Where's it going to come from? Yeah.
Very salient points. Maybe Thelma, from what are your thoughts around this? I mean, we are basically hearing, the kind of work and the kind of size of the chance in, networking the people, bringing them up to speak, interacting, whether you organize this regional and then, connecting them above, etc. And the lack of funding. How does this relate to the, well, maybe what Matthias was saying, to the potentially increasing situation that the impacts will become stronger, the situation become less hopeful, if I may say, and then a very strong push, most likely by those who have the resources and a limited understanding, to use and deploy these kind of activities. And I'm saying this also not we've all seen this, that even as small as this event might be, it's extremely significant that the private sector company basically decided to take action and construct a business model around this technique, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks. And so the question is, how do you see this kind of various pressures and tensions being resolved as next steps? To which, how do you see that processes you are involved in could potentially contribute, whether this is the IPCC and others, to addressing this challenge, that one doesn't increasingly be faced in a situation where the international governance does not address solar radiation modification as an emerging technology?
Okay, Kai. I think I'm going to give some scattered answers to your question.
Very good.
And obviously, please take my IPCC hat out, although
Absolutely.
I do see the importance of the science, presented by the IPCC, because it sets the foundations for the discussions. So it doesn't take any prescriptive way or anything, but it puts on the table the reality up to the stage that we are now in terms of scientific understanding. And so I think that the IPCC is evolving a lot, and we even have a concern not with only this topic, but other topics as well, because if we look at the literature that has been produced on SRM, it's very recent. So it's building up quickly. And IPCC in this last assessment was able to really put much more than it had in the previous assessment. Still maintaining the concern that we know things and we don't know things. So it is separating. It can be helpful here, but we don't know the implications. We don't know the overall implications, the regional distribution of the negative elements that we see from this. So that is one thing. So science is important. Another aspect, Kai, that I say, I have been in the government. There is nothing more concerned when the government comes to you and say, so what? Now we are saying, in some places research is already going on. We see some very worrisome deployment in a small scale. But, where is this leading to? And so, and governments, not necessarily, and I really acknowledge all the efforts that C2G has been putting to bring awareness to governments on these, the previously called geoengineering, that now we really set apart as CDM and solar radiation management. So I have faced the situations when the government called me and said, is this really happening? Is this really affecting, or is going to affect our, production, crop production? If so, where? So we need to be ready to respond to the government. And I see the role of the scientists as being, in that directions, because government, many people are just technical people that are there, or people that really do not know at depth all the elements that might be, on their plate. So, but there is one issue that I think that is not talking about deployment. I think that, there is a whole room for research that is lacking, and we should not prejudge that this research is going to be followed by deployment. No, it's just going to pave the way for a more informed discussion in different forums. That is how I see it. So, international community have a play on this? I think it does, but not necessarily on the nitty-gritty things. But I would say in setting up some principles, some ethical principles. Yeah. Okay, so I think there is a role there. But we talked about the partnerships, and we are seeing some initiatives. Like, for instance, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change Research has done a workshop, a couple of months ago, 3 months ago, and they came up with, forming a partnership. And obviously, they have the concern, where is the money coming from? And in that aspect, I think that you go stepwise. First, you organize yourself, and then you go after money. And I am sure that money will be there. Okay, so also how to really do the capacity building for some in some areas that is lacking. We do have a big gap in modeling, and all these studies that are being conducted based on modeling. They're based in models, right? So how to downscale those models to be useful regionally? Is that a weak staying in an institute that is doing these modeling exercises? Doesn't help. So we do have to have a strategic vision on how to move this. Honestly, I do not think that the fact that we are doing research on this would be an indication, but my country might not think about this like I'm saying. They might see that this is a preparation for, or an anticipation for, something that is inevitable. And so might be a little bit, constrained and not really looking forward, because we need first to put the ambition on the table, do whatever we can in terms of a global effort before thinking about this. But this might be too late. This is going to take 10 years, 15 years of maturity in the research. Research takes time. So if we put all these elements on the table, Kai, I think that we need to really have the regional strategies, regions thinking of the partnerships they want to do and how to advance. I am not sure if the governments are ready for that. Scientists are, because they know that they need to be prepared to respond to something that might come up in 10 years or 15 years. And if we don't start now, how can we help?
Thank you, Thelma. I think it was very helpful, because basically there's a dilemma of a need for policymakers to potentially intervene at this stage to set a frame and context, which is not too nitty-gritty, but sets the direction. I think, Matthias, you also alluded to this. And I think also some of the comments point to that need. For example, the one of Ms. Ribeiro just now is that there is a need to be clear that, research doesn't lead directly to the deployment, that it does not provide for an undermining, but at the same time recognizes the situation, at least if one looks at the IPCC conclusions you referred to get as ready as one can, that when the situation occurs, or maybe some people act independently. One has the science and the knowledge to react to. I mean, what you described mirrors the finding of this unit report I referred to, that the information base is not there. It's not enough to say yes and no. In terms of whether SRM in the context of an overshoot, obviously, and overshoot means it's also too important, I think, to clear overshoot. This doesn't mean for IPCC, and when one talks about it, that one goes beyond in an unlimited way the temperature. One is on a pathway which will stabilize at a particular goal level. So it's only in that context that, I mean, I think some of those, but this needs to be explicit. Currently, that's what people well-intended mean, but it's not. There's no framework in this world which is universal and enforceable and strong enough, as we have seen with this recent event of that private sector company, to prevent action which one doesn't want to allow for. So I think that's very helpful. Chris, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Sure, it's up for two reasons. The one is to apologize to Sylvia for removing her comment. I didn't know what I was doing, so I clicked done, and your comment went away. The one about how the IPCC say emissions reduction is what we have to do. No researcher in this field would disagree with that statement. We all recognize that that is what needs to happen, but we are also humans, and we know that we often do the wrong thing. So many of us are pessimistic that our governments are not going to adhere to what the IPCC recommends. Well, it doesn't recommend what the IPCC assesses. And as Thelma was saying, if in 10 years' time, this actually becomes real, so in West Africa, it becomes almost unlivable in 2050, it gets so hot. And if we continue with this trajectory, we need to be prepared to tell our governments what the potential impacts or effects might be of SRM. So this is why we're doing this. We're not the engineer or the guys at whatever the company is that put up the balloon. There are unscrupulous characters in here that do want to make money out of it. But we need to do the research to understand what that might mean. I'm sorry I deleted your comment. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. Matthias, go ahead.
Yeah, I would want to build on this and perhaps, point out, some are saying that we do not need SRM, and this is a very blanket statement, and what it should really say, we never will need SRM, and we're 100% certain of this. And I think this is, not something that we can declare today, even if, many of us, I think, would wish to make that statement and would really wish, this can just go away. We can just ignore this. But we don't have any supporting evidence. And in fact, for this to be a true statement, three things would need to never occur. And the first one is that we would be 200% successful in mitigating climate change through the ways in which we have already started. 200%, because the NDCs are not sufficient. And this is the discussion about overshoot. The second reason is we do not know really how the climate is responding to elevated levels of greenhouse gases. And that's the climate uncertainty, climate sensitivity that has remained uncertain over the last 20 years. We haven't resolved that uncertainty. So it might well be that the climate warms much more than what we on average would sort of expect. And the third one is we don't really know how humans will be able to cope with this warming once we are overshooting. And so there's the possibility that the damage and the suffering and the human toll of overshooting is incomparably worse than what we are thinking it might be. And so those three reasons, unless we can be certain that they will never occur, we cannot rule out SRM at this point. We cannot say that we will be able to use it in a sensible way either. But that's a different thing to declare SRM, unusable forever. So I think that's really the key issue here when we talk about risk or precautionary thinking. In my view, and the precautionary principle is quite ambiguous on this, in my view, the precautionary principle could also be suggesting that we need to explore much more seriously the different possibilities out there. As we've tried to point out with the SDG analysis, it really depends on how things play out and how things are approached overall.
Okay, thank you very much.
I need to respond to that. Yeah, Matthias, I hope I didn't rule out SRM. On the very contrary, as a researcher, I say I fully support this because I need to be ready. You know, scientists need to be ready. What I think is difficult is to convincing the governments, those that are there, high level, thinking, well, if we start talking about these things now, it might give the impression that we are not going to be in a position to not need it, right? So we may say, oh, okay, there will be technology there, so let's delay. So that's the problem. I honestly think that governments should seriously think about it, not in terms of deployment on readiness, to understand the impacts, regional impacts, in all aspects, social, economic, environmental, and then make a good decision if it comes, when it comes. But obviously, I didn't rule out the need for SRM. Yeah, so sorry if I conveyed that impression. Yeah.
No, I don't think so, Thelma. But I think the last conversation, and Santiago is eager, and he has to make the concluding remarks. But I think what it definitely shows is that that there will be governance requirement, even in the situation that, imagine we conclude in 5 years SRM is not an option, and we are going to face what Chris was describing in terms of the Northwest African situation and other situations. These situations will require governance and government and individual people's action and reaction. So we are in a situation where we have to think about, and the situation compels to think about, whether there is or not some technical help or not. And if not, it will also have consequences which are not trivial in terms of governance in the broader sense, which is not just government taking action, but me and my neighbor fighting over or not, or enjoying a new kind of food because it can grow in my garden now, whatever the positive and negative element is. With these kind of short reflections, over to you, Santiago, and for the concluding remarks of this event.
Thank you, Kai, and mostly thank you to Thelma, Matthias, Asima, and Chris, and well, to all the participants and the questions. Thank you very much. And as mentioned in a reply to Sylvia, this is a conversation we did not want to have here in ECLAC, but the inaction of emitters have pushed all of us to have it. We support the precautionary principle, Sylvia. As Matthias, I strongly support what you said, Matthias. However, the precautionary principle comes when there is uncertainty. And what we are here somehow agreeing is that we want to reduce uncertainty by research. Obviously, the precautionary principle will be there always. It's for us, it's a core value, but uncertainties need to be reduced. So that's the only aim for furthering the research and understanding of SRM. In this regard, that the IPCC says the SRM may be needed, but there are risks, and we need to create an adequate understanding of the risk and create a proper global governance. Thelma, you mentioned this risk scenario that is raising because of our inaction. We have not been capable to do what scientific evidence told us, and yes, governments some of them are also thinking that a colleague from Brazil, Carlos Musi, mentioned when you were talking with the parliamentarians, this reference to the IPCC are the doctors. You have diagnostic the Earth state and the society challenge, and you have said, well, you're ill, and instead of having the proper regime, we are still asking for the magical pill, and the magical pill, it seems, is SRM. And we know when we have a medical situation that endangers our health, that this magical pill usually is not or it doesn't exist, or it has huge side effects, and that's the case of SRM. So we need to do the proper preventive medical treatment, but we are not doing that. So that's the problem. That's the huge problem. And Chris, you mentioned we are humans, and we usually, more usually, make mistakes than take the right decisions. So Chris, you also mentioned that a very important thing for us in ECLAC, we always, for 75 years now, we are celebrating that, our anniversary. ECLAC has been supporting equity, social inclusion, and risk, climate risk, and SRM risk particularly could be hard with the poorest and the most vulnerable communities. And that has a lot of implications. So governments prevent the increasing risk of uncontrolled experimentation. And the Mexican case showed that there are already some actors that are taking decisions illegal. And we need to get a global governance to be able to influence the decision of some individuals, greedy individuals, as also Chris mentioned. So there is a growing movement to privatize climate action, and that's also our concern, because governments are neglecting their role, and they are telling we need the private sector engagement, and private sector solutions usually are more able to concentrate further the wealth if there is a solution, obviously. Anyhow, climate impacts will be very distributed, particularly deeper with the poorest, but no one will be able to avoid some of the impacts. So governments in action open the space for this private climate action with strong biases on the kind of climate solutions. So we need the climate solutions outcome to be equitable. And ASIMA, you mentioned that, and we totally agree on that. Some political constituencies are strongly engaged with technological solutions and this magic pill, and for legitimation purposes could accelerate the adoption of these kind of solutions despite the risk attached. And that was also mentioned. So at some point when the warming is increasing, some governments will push for this kind of solutions. So if there is not a governance and understanding in place, this risk will be much more higher. So research, knowledge has a value. Training and access of information, as Asima said, is a basic step, but further specialized R&D should be also in place. We need to understand what SRM potential solutions entail and test them first. And as Matthias mentioned, there are potential huge institutional and geopolitical consequences. Therefore, we all, the Global South, need to prepare for a governance setting process. This is why we in ECLAC think that this preparation requires a coordinated regional approach. In the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we are trying to understand the governments, what they want, and to convene, when it's possible, some meetings, and that is what Silvia, you mentioned. We will post something in the coming months, but also that depends on our governance body, that is the governments of Latin America. There is more appetite from Mexico in particular, but other countries as well. So trust and collaboration would be needed, as Matthias mentioned, and informing, consulting, collaborating, and including, as Asima mentioned as well, is basic for these processes. In this regard, the proposal by Chris is appealing, and SRM has a regional and global impacts, and not only in the physical environment, but on social and political aspects as well. So we need to support a Southern research initiative, as you proposed, Chris. And from the Latin American side, we will try to do something like that, but we are limited in our reach. So about the UN role, and Matthias, you answered already this question. We think SRM will have a global consequences. So the governments in a global space, the UN is the right space. But it is true that UN processes are in environmental issues decisions are made by consensus. So they are very slow. So we need, we welcome other processes that could help build the governance. Definitely, we welcome them. Then it is right to remind that, as Thelma said, climate change brings irreversible impacts, and SRM only solves the warm part of the global warming. So preparing to SRM as solutions, quoted, do not set aside our responsibility to accelerate and deepening climate action. And as Kai mentioned, we need to shift from walking to sprinting. We need climate action now, and SRM should not be, is in the menu, but should not be eaten. Thanks.
Thank you for wrapping up the event, Santiago, and for addressing all of the issues that we've been discussing. It was a fascinating conversation. As always, we never have enough time to go into more depth, but look forward to continued conversations. I'd just like to thank you all, panelist speakers, for your participation in this event, for your very insightful presentations, and thank the participants who connected today for their interest and interesting questions as well. You can find more information on this issue and a bunch of related issues to solar radiation modification governance on our website, www.c2g2.net. And that wraps it up. Sorry, we went a little bit over time. We look forward to seeing you next time. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye.